Tessa Whitlock was 27, carrying a tray through the private dining room of an upscale Chicago restaurant, with hands rough from 2 shifts, back to back, and auburn hair pinned up in a hurry. Her gray eyes stayed lowered, but not because she was afraid. Tessa had simply learned that people were safer to watch than to trust. For 4 years, she served coffee, cleared plates, smiled when required, and never gave anyone a single piece of her real life. Her coworkers called her the stuck-up girl with the worn-out shoes. Customers barely remembered her face once the check was paid. None of them knew what she did every Wednesday night after closing. None of them knew she walked alone to a community center and sat through sign language class until her fingers ached, not for herself. For the little brother who had lost part of his hearing after a fever years ago, Tessa was not cold. She was exhausted. She was careful. And she had spent years becoming invisible on purpose. Until one night, in that private dining room, the most dangerous man in Chicago started watching her back. That's why when Brett, the resentful shift manager, assigned her to wait on the most feared customer in the place that Thursday night, with that half-smile passing through the whole group, all she saw was the way their eyes lit up like they'd already decided something about her without asking. The customer was Salvatore Marchetti, 33, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair combed back with a few early streaks of silver at the temples. A faint scar running down his left cheekbone and eyes so still they were cold. The whole restaurant whispered he ran the underworld on the city's west side, that he came in alone every Thursday to a closed room, tipped generously, and never answered a word to anyone. People said he was arrogant, said he faked being deaf just to seem important, and that was exactly the joke Brett and his crew had set up. They pushed the poorest waitress they had into that room and crouched behind the service door to watch her get ignored by the boss until she fled in humiliation. What none of them ever imagined was that Salvatore wasn't pretending at all. He truly hadn't heard a single sound since the blast that took his father and his hearing 15 years before. He read lips off every face in front of him and guarded that secret, like his life depended on it, because in his world a weakness exposed was a death sentence. So, when Tessa set the tray down, read the menu, and got nothing back, she froze for just a couple of seconds, and then instead of falling apart the way the whole crew was praying she would, she looked him dead in the eye, raised her calloused hands, and began to sign slow and clear. "Hello, I'm your server tonight. What would you like?" And for the first time in years, a stranger was speaking to Salvatore Marchetti in his own language. The notorious boss's head snapped up. That ice-cold stare cracked right down the middle, and behind the service door, 3 grinning faces twisted into confusion, unable to comprehend what those moving hands meant. Their petty show to humiliate a poor girl had slipped out of their control, leaving them deeply frustrated and determined to watch her even closer in the weeks to come. Entirely unaware that this was the beginning of something that would eventually leave every last one of them silent. If you believe a person's dignity should never be somebody else's punchline, hit that like button so this story can reach more people. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next healing story we tell. That moment in the private room eventually closed like every other shift. Tessa took off her apron close to midnight, walked to the bus stop beneath the light drizzle of Chicago, and let the city drift past behind the fogged glass all the way back to the south side, where her one-room apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an old building, with stairs that always smelled damp, and a hallway light that flickered, even though the landlord had promised to fix it 2 winters ago. She opened the door very quietly because she knew Danny was asleep. Her 2-year-old brother had left the desk lamp on, and a small note beside the rice pot saying that he had saved a portion for her. Only a few crooked words, but enough to make her stand still for a while in the cramped kitchen. Because after a long day filled with faces that looked at her as though she were a piece of cheap furniture, that scrap of paper was the only thing reminding her that she was still a human being someone was waiting for. Danny had lost part of his hearing after a fever when he was 7, and that event had long since belonged to a distant past. Neither of them saw it as a wound anymore, only as a silence they had learned to live beside. It was because of him that Tessa first found her way to sign language classes, awkward at first with every movement of her hands, until little by little that language became the way the 2 siblings told each other things sound could not carry. She still remembered the feeling of the first time Danny fully understood a sentence she signed and burst out laughing. A laugh unlike any other. And from that moment on she understood that the deepest conversations sometimes did not need a single sound. Their mother had died years earlier after a long time in the hospital, while their father had searched for answers at the bottom of liquor bottles, and then one day quietly never came back. Tessa did not often tell these things to anyone. Not because she was ashamed, but because she had learned early that every piece of her life she handed over could become something others used to define her. So she put them away like old papers in the bottom drawer. In that drawer were still the hospital bills from the time her mother had been ill. Bills she continued paying little by little each month. Those numbers were like a shadow she carried with her, but she had grown so used to it that she no longer let it bend her down. She simply worked 2 shifts, gathered every dollar in tips, and kept going. Her avoidance of the post-shift gossip and late-night drinks only fueled the kitchen's resentment, cementing her reputation as an outcast who simply didn't belong. Not one of them bothered to wonder where a person who finished work at midnight and then showed up again early the next morning for another shift was supposed to find the time or the money for those little pleasures. They saw her silence and hurried to name it coldness, when the truth was that she had never been cold. She was only careful because there had been a time when she trusted someone. And that one time taught her a lesson she did not want to learn again. Keeping her distance was not an attitude for her, but a rule for survival. A wall she had built not to push other people away, but to protect the soft part still left inside her. That night she sat down at the dining table and quietly ate the portion of rice Danny had saved for her. Now cold, and after what felt like an eternity, her mind did not feel as empty as it usually did. Because all the way home she had kept thinking about the eyes of the man in the private room, eyes the entire restaurant whispered were as cold as ice, yet in which she had seen something very different when she lifted her hands and spoke to him in her own language. She did not understand why Brett had chosen to push her into that room. Nor did she know yet that behind the crack in the door, 3 faces had been waiting to watch her fall apart. She only knew that for a few brief minutes a stranger had looked at her not as if she were an object, but as if she were a human being. And that, though she did not yet dare name it, had slipped like a small beam of light into the walls she had spent so long building. She washed the dishes, turned off the lights, stood by the window, looking down at the rain-wet street blurred with yellow lamplight, and told herself that tomorrow she would go to work on time again, wipe the tables clean, and keep herself closed off as always. But even as she thought that, she dimly felt that something had begun to shift very quietly, like a door opening a crack before anyone had decided whether it should be opened all the way. Wednesday evening was the only night of the week when Tessa allowed herself to step outside the cycle of 2 shifts. It was the night she went to sign language class at the community center, at the end of a quiet street on the south side of the city. An old room with plastic chairs arranged in a circle, and a white board still faintly marked by old ink. But to her it was almost the only place where she felt she could breathe. The teacher was a deaf woman named Mrs. Adeline, who never taught sign language as a list of movements to memorize, but as a language with breath, with nuance, with facial expression and silence. She often said with her hands that hands knew how to tell the things the throat kept hidden. And Tessa remembered that sentence because it was truer of her than she had ever admitted. This wasn't a language chosen out of curiosity. It was a lifeline forged in the quiet aftermath of her brother's childhood illness, the only bridge left to cross his widening silence. Tessa, who had only been a child a few years older than him, had stood before the room where her brother sat and realized that if she did not find another way to speak with Danny, the distance between them would keep widening year after year, and that was what frightened her more than anything else. More than poverty, more than long nights. So, she began to learn awkwardly and quietly from old books borrowed at the library, then from free classes like this one. Those early hardships had shaped her entire world, forcing her and Danny to become each other's sole shelter in a silent house. Tessa did not tell these things to the class. Here, she did not need to tell them. Here, people understood one another through a look, a gesture, a pause at exactly the right moment, and in that wordless understanding she found a peace the long day outside had never given her anywhere else. That evening, Mrs. Adeline signed a question to the whole class, asking what made each person stay with this difficult language. And when it was Tessa's turn, she lifted her hands and slowly told them that she learned so that every night when she came home, she could still ask her brother how his day had been, and receive a full answer, not just a passing nod. That she learned so Danny would never have to feel abandoned alone inside his own silence. When she lowered her hands, the whole room went still for a beat. Mrs. Adeline looked at her for a long time, then signed that Tessa was not only learning this language, she was keeping a promise. And Tessa felt her throat tighten because that was exactly what she had never named, but had carried for all these years. Sign language had long since stopped being a skill she practiced. It had become her second language, a part of who she was, the part no one at the restaurant knew about, the part she kept hidden like a jewel tucked inside a worn coat pocket. That night, on the way home, she thought about the previous Thursday evening, about the man in the private room, and the moment she lifted her hands to speak with him. She realized it was the first time the language she had kept only for Danny had stepped outside and reached a stranger. And strangely, that did not make her feel as though she had lost something. It made her feel as though something had been connected again, as though the most beautiful part of her, once reserved for only one person, had found another place where it could exist. When she got home, Danny was still awake, sitting at the table and sketching technical drawings for his trade class. Seeing his sister come in, he looked up and signed to ask how class had been. Tessa sat down across from him, and instead of telling him about the class, she signed the story of a guest at the restaurant who had unexpectedly understood the language the two siblings shared. Danny raised his eyebrows with curiosity, then laughed and teased her in signs, saying that finally someone else in the world could talk to her the way he did. Tessa laughed with him, a rare, light laugh. But even inside that warm moment, she could not have known that the Thursday evening that seemed so accidental had actually been a trap laid in advance, and that the people at the restaurant had watched her step into that room with an intention she had not yet discovered. As those Thursday nights in the private room became a quiet routine, the initial shock of their first meeting dissolved into a comfortable connection. The man seated at the head of the table no longer looked at her as a mere server, and she no longer saw him as a distant stranger. He set his glass down very slowly, and with each passing week their conversations grew naturally. Every movement he made was firm and precise, like someone who had lived with silence long enough to turn it into a language of his own flesh and blood. Tessa, who had once frozen in nervousness, now found herself speaking freely about her life, replying that she had learned it to speak with her younger brother, someone who also lived in a world with less sound than other people. He nodded, without pity, without one of those hollow exclamations people usually made when they heard stories like that. She recalled how he had signed during one of their first evenings together, that she had come here to serve, not to be sent in as a pawn, a sentence that had made her realize the man in front of her was far sharper than the cold appearance the whole restaurant whispered about. During their dinners, she would sign the dishes on the menu, and when she once accidentally mentioned that the soup had probably cooled a little because it had been left too long on the counter, he lifted one eyebrow and answered with his hands that he couldn't hear the noise of this whole city anyway. So if a bowl of cold soup complained a little, he wouldn't hear that either. So they were even. Tessa laughed, the sound escaping before she could stop it. A real laugh she had let fall in this workplace after so many months, because she had not expected the man everyone feared to have such a dry, sly humor hidden behind that calm face. And that laugh was like a pebble thrown onto the still surface of a lake between them. He saw her smile, and something in his eyes softened, as if the icy coldness she had heard so much about was only the outer shell of someone far too used to no one bothering to truly speak with him. The service that was supposed to last only 5 minutes, only taking his order and leaving, now regularly stretched much longer. He asked about her younger brother, about his trade school, and she told him a few careful things, just enough. Then he signed that most people who sat across from him chose to speak very loudly and very slowly, as if volume could cure everything, or worse, turned to speak to the person beside him as if he weren't even in the room. Tessa watched his hands intently, realizing that what he was describing was exactly what she felt every day in this restaurant, the feeling of being present right there, and yet still somehow invisible. Two strangers in a private room suddenly found in each other a shared language wider than the movements of their hands, the understanding of two people used to being looked at without truly being seen. Meanwhile, on the other side of the door, where a narrow crack opened toward the service corridor, the three faces that had expected a one-time humiliating scene were growing more frustrated by the day. They had stood there with half smiles, waiting for the poor girl to stumble. But week after week, all they witnessed was two pairs of hands answering each other in smooth rhythm, the laughter of someone they had been certain would cry, and the gaze of a boss everyone believed was cold, fixed carefully on every movement of the server they had pushed inside as a joke. One of them lightly nudged another. No one said anything, and one by one they quietly withdrew from the crack in the door, carrying with them the deepening frustration of people who had staged a performance only to watch its ending slip out of their hands permanently. Inside, Tessa was completely unaware of the malicious audience that had just dispersed. She only felt time passing strangely fast, and when she finally left the room to return to work, she had no idea that the evening she thought was only an ordinary shift had quietly changed something very large, not only inside her but also inside the man everyone believed had closed himself off, completely at the far end of the hallway. The sense of relief and warmth from that private room stayed with Tessa through the rest of the shift. She carried dishes, cleared tables, wiped down the counter with an energy she had not felt in a long time, her mind still holding the echo of her own laughter and the way that man had looked at her as if she were a human being instead of a shadow. But that happiness, as she would soon realize, lasted only until the exact moment she stepped down into the dishwashing area behind the kitchen to put away the last stack of trays before clocking out. There, hidden behind the rows of stainless steel racks and the sound of running water, Brett and Carla were standing and laughing together. And because they did not know she had come close, the words they let fall were not guarded at all. Carla was wiping her hands and giggling as she said she had thought the girl would just stand there like a statue and then run out sobbing. Who would guessed? While Brett gave a frustrated, bitter laugh and answered that all their planning had been completely ruined. He complained that week after week they had been wasting their time standing outside the crack in the door, constantly waiting to see her embarrass herself with that stone-deaf boss only to get nothing. Hearing those careless, joking sentences, the painful reality of that Thursday night suddenly pierced through Tessa with absolute clarity. The puzzle pieces finally fell into place. The malicious smirks, the sudden assignment, and their calculated silence. She hadn't been given a difficult shift by chance. She and the unsuspecting guest had been served up as a cheap spectacle for their coworkers' twisted entertainment. Tessa stood frozen behind the rack, the stack of trays still in her hands, and she felt the warm happiness that only minutes before had filled her heart begin to harden, then sour inside her chest, thick and bitter, like something beautiful left too long in the open air until it spoiled before it could be saved. But what hurt the most, strangely enough, was not that she had been turned into a joke, because she was used to being dismissed, used to eyes treating her like furniture. A joke aimed at her was something she could endure and let pass, as she had let so many things pass before. What truly chilled her and stirred a slow anger inside her was that they had dragged that man into their joke without thinking of him for even 1 second as a human being. They called him that stone-deaf boss with a laughing tone, as if the fact that he could not hear was a flaw worth using for entertainment. They had taken the very part of him he kept most hidden, the part he had to protect as if protecting his own life, and used it as material for a cheap little performance. Tessa thought of Danny and how she had fought all her life so her brother would never be turned into a joke simply because he lived in a world with fewer sounds. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that if she hadn't stepped up to sign, a completely innocent man would have been left sitting in silent discomfort, targeted by a cruelty he couldn't even hear coming. That thought made her grip the stack of trays so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She did not step forward. She did not speak. She did not let Brett and Carla know that she had heard everything, because she knew the anger inside her, if released now, would only become a noisy argument that would fade without changing anything. She quietly set the trays down, turned away, and on the entire ride home that night, she no longer thought about the warm laughter inside the private room. She thought only of one question returning again and again in her mind. How many times in life were people willing to turn another person's dignity into entertainment, simply because they believed that person would never know? And whether she could keep walking silently past this, as she had always walked silently past everything else. All that week, Tessa carried that slow-burning anger with her like a small stone in her coat pocket, not heavy enough to make her collapse, but sharp enough that every time she touched it, it hurt. She still came to work on time, still wiped the tables clean, still kept herself closed off, and she had almost convinced herself that that Thursday night had only been one more incident that would pass like everything else, until the very next Thursday evening when that man appeared again at the restaurant door with his familiar, calm stride. This time, instead of silently walking straight into the room at the end of the hallway as usual, he stopped at the host stand, looked directly at Brett, and with a brief handwritten note requested by name, the server from last Thursday night, to serve him privately. No one else. Tessa stood a few steps away and clearly saw Brett's face change. His usual mocking expression vanished, replaced by the awkwardness of a man who had just realized the joke he had set up had turned back in a direction he could no longer control. He glanced at her for a moment, then gave a stiff nod, and so Tessa carried the tray back into that private room, this time with an entirely different state of mind, no longer the person pushed inside to be a joke, but the person chosen by the guest himself. When she closed the door and turned toward him, He signed for her to sit down for a moment, saying that he wasn't used to letting the person across from him stand while he had a conversation. Tessa hesitated because that went against every rule of the job, but something in his eyes made her set the tray down and sit on the edge of the chair. Then he began to tell her, slowly and clearly, something she could feel he had not told many people. He signed and asked whether she knew why this whole city whispered that he only pretended to be deaf to seem important. And without waiting for her answer, he answered himself, saying that he let that rumor live, that he had even felt relieved when people believed it because in the world he lived in, a rumor about arrogance was harmless, while the truth about a weakness could make a man pay dearly. He told her that he had not heard a single sound since an event many years earlier. The day an explosion took his ear from him and took his hearing along with it. He spoke of it calmly, as if speaking of some distant winter, without self-pity, without exaggeration, only as a truth he had learned to live beside. He lifted his hand and touched the faint scar running along his cheekbone, then signed that people looked at the scar and imagined all kinds of dramatic underworld stories, but to him it was only what remained of the day. He lost many things at once, and was forced to grow up overnight. He said that after that, he learned to read the lips of everyone around him, learned to observe so carefully that no one realized he was compensating for what he lacked, and he hid it so completely that only a few of the most trusted people beside him knew the truth. Because in his world, revealing a weakness was no different from signing his own sentence. Tessa listened with all her eyes, and she understood that the man before her was giving her something more precious than ordinary trust. He was placing in her hands the very part of himself he had spent his whole life protecting. She signed and asked why he would tell all this to a server he had only met once. He looked at her for a moment, then answered that it was because she was the first person in many years to walk into this room and speak to him as if he were an ordinary human being, not a frightening boss or a pitiful. That she did not speak louder, did not speak slower, did not pity him and did not fear him. She had simply talked to him, and that was so rare to him that he had almost forgotten what it felt like. As he said that, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly into a very small smile, the first smile Tessa had ever seen on that cold face. A fleeting smile, but enough for her to feel the wall between them move back a little more. And in that moment, she realized that the anger she had carried all week had not softened, it had only changed into something else. A quiet wish that this man, whoever he might be in the outside world, deserved to be treated with more kindness than the people hiding behind the crack in the door had shown him. After that Thursday night, something Tessa had not expected began quietly unfolding around her. Because the fact that the restaurant's most powerful and mysterious guest had specifically requested one single server was not the sort of thing that could stay hidden for long in a place where people lived on whispers. Within a few days, the way her coworkers looked at her had changed. It was no longer only the dismissive look they had once given the ragged little snob, but something mixed with curiosity, scrutiny, and in some of them jealousy. They began to notice that every Thursday night she was called into the room at the end of the hallway, that she stayed inside much longer than an ordinary service would require, and that when she came out, there was a strange calmness on her face that they could not explain. The person most irritated by that change was none other than Brett. His cruel scheme had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking Tessa's spirit for a shared laugh, he had inadvertently elevated her, watching the very woman he sought to humiliate become the preferred confidant of the restaurant's most formidable guest, ate away at his pride day by day, while he, the man who had always assumed he had the right to arrange everything in that place, was looked straight in the face by that same man and not given even a single word in response. The feeling of being ignored on his own territory fueled a deep resentment within him, and Brett began doing what prideful people often do when they cannot bear to see someone they look down on rise above them. He began planting suggestive comments. At first only a few sentences tossed out as if by accident during busy moments in the kitchen, saying it was strange, wasn't it, that some girl with nothing special about her had suddenly caught the boss's eye, that who knew what the two of them were doing in that private room. Those half-joking, half-serious remarks were dropped by him at exactly the moments when many people were around, vague enough that he could deny them and claim he was only having fun, but poisonous enough to plant a distorted image of her in the minds of those listening. Carla, who had already disliked Tessa, immediately joined in adding color and venom to every rumor until the original story had been twisted many times over through every mouth that passed it along. And just like that, the name Tessa, belonging to a woman who had spent her whole life wanting only to be left in peace and remain invisible, suddenly became the hottest subject of gossip in the kitchen after the dinner rush. The cruel irony was that the quieter she remained, the more she refused to explain herself, the more those spreading the rumors interpreted her silence as a confession. In the midst of that thickening atmosphere, one person began to feel uneasy, and that was Owen, the youngest waiter in the group, the one who had also stood behind the crack in the door with Brett and Carla that Thursday night to join in the joke. Owen was not a cruel person. He was only young and weak-willed, easily swept along by the crowd, and afraid of becoming the outsider. But as he watched the rumor drift farther and farther from what he had once thought was only harmless teasing, as he saw it begin to aim at Tessa's dignity in a way that grew harder and harder to hear, something inside him started to ache with guilt. He remembered her calm face when she stepped out of the room, remembered that during all these weeks she had done nothing to deserve words like that, and he began to dimly realize that he had helped create something unkind, even if all he had done was stand there and laugh along. Owen still did not have enough courage to speak up. He remained silent whenever Brett made another remark, still lowering his face and avoiding Tessa's eyes whenever he passed her. But the uneasiness inside him kept growing like a seed planted in the wrong place, and although he did not know it yet, that slow gnawing guilt would later become the thing that made all the difference. For now, in the kitchen growing more suffocating by the day with whispers, Tessa continued quietly doing her work, not yet knowing that the storm of rumors Brett had just sparked was only beginning, and that soon it would force her to choose between continuing to stay silent as she always had, or standing up to draw a boundary she had spent her whole life trying to avoid. Despite the whispers circling around her outside that room, the Thursday evenings in the room at the end of the hallway kept arriving steadily, and little by little they became a stretch of time Tessa, though she would not admit it even to herself, quietly began to look forward to, because it was the only place where she was not the ragged little snob or the subject of kitchen gossip, but simply a human being listened to. And if the last time had been Salvatore opening himself enough to tell her the thing he hid most deeply, then this time, for reasons she did not fully understand, Tessa found herself wanting to speak. Perhaps because she had seen him offer her his truth, she felt it would be unfair to keep hiding forever behind her own wall. That day, when he signed and asked why someone as young as she was had chosen to live so closed off, she stayed silent for a long while, then slowly lifted her hands and began to tell him. She told him that there had once been a time when she had not been this way, that once there had been someone she trusted enough to tell everything about her life, someone she had seen as a refuge during the hardest days, and because she had placed her trust so completely in that person, she had not been on guard when they asked to borrow the money she had saved $1 at a time for months, money she had set aside for something important connected to her younger brother. Then one day, that person disappeared with all of it without a single explanation, leaving her with empty hands and a lesson she never wanted to learn again. She signed that what had hurt her most was not losing the money. Money could be earned again by taking extra shifts. What broke her was realizing that she had trusted the wrong person, that the softest part of herself, the part she had opened to someone, had been used by that very person to wound her. And from then on, she learned to build walls, not because she was cold the way people thought, but because she was afraid that if she opened herself one more time, the next wound might be one she could not rise from. Salvatore watched every movement of her hands without interrupting once, without rushing to comfort her, without offering empty advice. He only looked at her with eyes that told her he understood. Then she went on and told him about Danny, about her 22-year-old brother who was studying a trade, and about the fever when he was little that had taken part of his hearing and turned his world into a place with fewer sounds than other people's. She told him that Danny was the reason she had found her way to sign language, that the money she had been tricked out of years ago had been meant for him, and that no matter how much life took from her, she had always told herself she would never let her brother feel abandoned alone inside his eyes' own silence. When she spoke of Danny, something changed in Salvatore's eyes. He sat a little straighter, more attentive, because this was the first time he had heard about that younger brother, about the true reason a poor server could be fluent in the very language he had been forced to live with all his life. And he realized that her speaking hands were not a lucky accident, but the result of years of quiet love. He lifted his hands and signed a sentence. Tessa would remember for a long time afterward that most people believed listening belonged to the ears, but he knew better than anyone that there were people who could hear every sound in the world and still never truly hear another person, while there were others who could not hear a single sound and yet listened more clearly than anyone else. When he finished signing, they both fell silent, a silence that was not awkward at all, but strangely warm, as if inside that private room, Two people who were used to hiding behind walls had just realized that they were seeing each other in a way very few people in their lives ever had. Two wounds from two different lives. One person closed off because her trust had been betrayed, the other lonely in the middle of his own power. And yet when they reflected each other, they did not deepen the pain. Strangely, they eased it a little. And Tessa left that room that night with a feeling she had not had in a very long time. The feeling that perhaps not every open door led to a new wound, that perhaps there were still people in this world worth stepping past her own wall for, worth trusting one more time. The warmth Tessa carried home from that private room that night did not survive long against what was waiting for her at the restaurant. Because while she had found a place where she was heard, out there under Brett's hand, the whispers that had begun as insinuations no longer stopped at harmless hints, but quickly turned into something far more poisonous. He no longer merely tossed out a few half-joking comments in the kitchen. He began pushing them into the staff group chat, where everyone could read them and no one dared oppose him. He wrote messages implying that the only reason an ordinary girl like Tessa had suddenly become favored by the most powerful guest was that she knew how to trade, that she was clinging to a wealthy and influential man from the underworld to find a way to climb out of her poor server's life. He wrapped those words in the disguise of joking, adding a few laughing symbols to make them seem harmless, but everyone who read them understood that he was deliberately smearing her dignity in the filthiest way. And what pushed everything beyond the boundary of ordinary teasing was that Brett did not stop at words. He began doing things that made Tessa feel uneasy whenever she was near him. He deliberately blocked her path in the narrow hallways behind the kitchen, so she would be forced to squeeze past him, made comments about her body in that mocking tone, and whenever she showed discomfort, he laughed it off and said she was being too tense, that he was only joking. That habit of turning the victim into the one overreacting left Tessa both angry and trapped, because he was the shift manager, the person who held her schedule and her job in his hands, and she understood that if she made the matter bigger, the first person likely to suffer would be her. What mattered was that Tessa was not the only victim. During those days, she dimly began to realize through averted eyes and broken scraps of conversation that there had been other girls who had worked there before her and endured the same kind of behavior from Brett, then quietly quit without reporting anything because everyone was afraid. Everyone needed the job, and everyone knew that the voice of a server carried very little weight against a manager who was well liked by the higher-ups. That unspoken truth covered the whole restaurant in a suffocating atmosphere people chose to live with in silence. The mood during shifts gradually changed. Some coworkers who had once only been indifferent now looked at Tessa with a mixture of pity and avoidance, as if she were a problem best kept at a distance. Others believed Brett's words and made comments behind her back, and Tessa, who had spent her whole life wanting only to remain invisible, now found herself becoming the center of exactly what she feared most: attention laced with malice. In the middle of all that, Owen was the one most tormented. He read every message Brett posted in the group chat and felt his stomach tighten because he knew those words were lies. He had seen with his own eyes how quietly and decently Tessa had worked for all these months, and he also knew the real Brett behind that cheerful mask. He remembered that Thursday night when he himself had stood behind the crack in the door and laughed along. And the more he thought about it, the more disgusted he felt with himself for having once treated the humiliation of another human being as entertainment. Owen's guilt was no longer a vague feeling. It had become a real weight pressing on his chest every time he came to work. He began quietly paying attention, remembering what Brett said and did, even though he did not yet know what he was keeping those details for. He still did not have enough courage to stand publicly on Tessa's side, still feared the price he might pay for going against someone more powerful than himself. But something inside him had changed beyond reversal. He could no longer pretend that what was happening was only a harmless joke. And deep down, he knew that a time would come when he would be forced to choose between continuing to stay silent out of fear or stepping forward to speak the truth he was holding. And Tessa, walking into the restaurant every day amid those stares and rumors, was also moving closer to the day when she could no longer endure another moment of it. The day Tessa could no longer endure, it finally came on an afternoon when she went down to the wine storage room in the back to get a few more bottles for the evening shift. As she picked up a crate, Brett and Carla blocked the narrow exit, their faces twisted into those familiar mocking smiles as they threw out another casual comment about her late-night visits to the private room. They expected her to look down and squeeze past them in silence as she always did. Instead, Tessa set the crate of wine down heavily, stood her ground, and for the first time after so many months, she looked Brett directly in the eye. Her voice was not a shout, nor did it hold tears, but it was so slow and decisive that the mocking smiles on their faces instantly froze. She told them she had known for weeks about the cruel trap they had set for her that Thursday night, and that she had heard every bitter word they shared behind her back. She didn't step back. She stepped forward, forcing Brett to take a clumsy step backward into the wooden shelves. Brett opened his mouth, ready to laugh it off, and throw out his familiar line about why she was making such a big deal out of it. They were only joking. But Tessa did not let him finish. She looked straight into his eyes and said she had not come here to argue about whether she had been hurt, because a joke aimed at her was something she was used to enduring and could let pass. What she could not let pass, what had made her stand here and say these words, was that they had used a person's inability to hear as something to amuse themselves with. She said they had called that man the stone-deaf boss in a mocking tone, as if the fact that he lived in a world with fewer sounds was a flaw worth turning into a joke, without thinking of him as a human being for even 1 second. She said that if she had not happened to know sign language that night, the person left sitting in discomfort would not have been her, but him. A man turned by a group of people hiding behind a door into the center of a joke he did not even know was being made at his expense, and that was not joking. That was cruelty dressed up as fun. Tessa's voice never grew louder, but every word she spoke was so clear and so heavy that the storage room, usually humming with the sound of the cooling unit, seemed to fall completely still. She went on saying that she had a younger brother who also lived in a world with fewer sounds, and that she had fought her whole life so no one would ever be allowed to look at him as a joke. So she understood very well how humiliating and unfair it was to have someone turn your difference into material for entertainment. She looked at Carla, then at Brett, and said she was not asking them to like her. They could go on hating her as much as they wanted, but there was a boundary they had to understand from now on, and that was that they had no right to take anyone's dignity, whether hers or that man's or anyone else's, and turn it into entertainment for their boredom. Carla, who was usually so sharp-tongued, could not say a single word this time. Her face went pale, and she turned away as if trying to avoid Tessa's eyes. Brett stood there with the mocking smile that was always on his lips, now completely gone. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to salvage something, but then fell silent because for the first time someone had dared to say directly to his face the bare truth of what he had done, and he realized that all his familiar excuses had become hollow before what she had just said. Only then did Tessa notice Owen standing tucked near the entrance to the storage room. He had witnessed everything, and when her eyes passed over him, he quickly lowered his head, both ears burning red with shame, not because she had said anything to him, but because every word she had just spoken had also exposed the cowardly part inside him. Tessa said nothing more. She bent down, picked up the crate of wine, and walked out of the storage room, leaving behind a heavy silence in which, for the first time, no one was laughing anymore. After the confrontation in the wine storage room, Brett stayed silent for a few days, but that silence was not remorse. It was the pressure building inside a man who had just been humiliated, and was looking for a way to reclaim the dignity he believed he had lost. And the way people like Brett usually chose to patch up their wounded pride was by bragging. He began whispering to a few people in the restaurant, and to some acquaintances outside, that he was not someone to be taken lightly, that he had close connections with Marchetti's people, that the powerful guest who often came to the restaurant actually respected him. He embroidered those lies to make himself look bigger in other people's eyes, without realizing that in the world he was using as a shield, pretending to have a relationship that did not exist, was not a joke. His boasting, carried through a few mouths outside, eventually reached a man named Big Mike, Salvatore's trusted right-hand man, the person responsible for keeping an eye on anything that might affect the reputation and safety of the organization. And to men like Big Mike, a stranger going around claiming friendship with their people was something that could not be ignored. Not because it was insulting, but because it was dangerous. Because once that name was borrowed by outsiders to impress others, it could drag the organization into trouble it never wanted to touch. So, one evening, when the shift was almost over, 2 well-dressed men entered the restaurant, calm and polite enough that no one noticed them until they walked straight toward Brett and courteously asked him to step outside for a few words. Tessa was cleaning near the entrance then, so she happened to witness the whole thing, and she clearly saw the way Brett's face changed when he recognized who those men were. They did not raise their voices. They made no visible threatening gesture. One of them simply stood very close to Brett and spoke to him in a low, even voice that Tessa could not fully hear, but she could see the effect of those words appearing on Brett's face little by little. Brett's usual arrogance disappeared, replaced by the pallor of someone who had just understood that he had been playing with something whose true weight he had never known. The man reminded him of only one thing, that there were names that should not be borrowed for little acts of showing off, that this time they had come only to make things clear and keep it polite, and that they trusted there would be no need for a second time. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, they nodded in farewell, turned, and left, leaving Brett rooted to the spot with a bloodless face and slightly trembling hands. The whole thing lasted only a few minutes without a single loud sound, without one rough action, and yet it left behind a chill in the air more frightening than any noisy argument. Tessa, who had seen everything from a hidden corner, stood motionless with the cleaning cloth still in her hand, because this was the first time she had seen with her own eyes the real world standing behind the man she sat with every Thursday night in that private room. She realized that the calmness and kindness she had seen in him inside that room were only one side of him, while the other side was a power that could make an arrogant man like Brett tremble with only a few words. What made her shiver was not violence, because no violence had happened at all, but that invisible weight, the way the mere existence of a name was enough to create fear. Tessa stood there and for the first time clearly felt that standing near that man did not only mean warm evenings and conversations carried by hands. It also came with a price, with a world of hidden rules completely foreign to her, and inside her, beside all the feelings slowly growing, a new question slipped in for the first time, a question she did not yet dare answer. Whether someone like her, with a younger brother who needed protection, could step into the orbit of a world like that, and that night she walked home with the shadow of that question weighing more heavily on her shoulders than any stack of bills or rumor ever had. That night Tessa couldn't sleep. She got back to the apartment on the south side when it was already late, and opened the door as quietly as always, so she wouldn't wake Danny. But instead of collapsing into bed from exhaustion after 2 shifts the way she usually did, she sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark, both hands wrapped around the cup of tea she had made earlier, but had forgotten to drink until it had gone cold. The image from the restaurant kept returning again and again in her mind and refused to let her go. Not the image of a fight or anything truly terrible, but the very quietness of it was what made her shiver. The way 2 unfamiliar men only had to stand close and say a few words for an arrogant man like Brett to turn pale and tremble. That invisible weight now covered her thoughts with a fear she couldn't name, but could feel clearly in every heartbeat moving faster than usual. She thought of Salvatore, of the warm Thursday nights in the private room, of his rare smile, and he listened to her with his whole gaze, and then she thought of the scene she had just witnessed, and for the first time, those 2 images crashed violently into each other inside her. The gentleman in the private room, and the cold world standing behind him, turned out to belong to the same person. And Tessa realized that all this time she had only seen one half, the half he had allowed her to see, while the other half, the one she had accidentally brushed against, was a dangerous orbit where she did not belong at all. But what chilled her more than anything was not fear for herself. It was Danny. The thought of her brother struck so suddenly that her chest tightened, and she looked toward the small room where he was sleeping. Her two-year-old brother, the one she had spent her whole youth protecting, the one who lived in a world with fewer sounds, and therefore, in her eyes, always needed to be protected just a little more. She wondered whether, if she allowed herself to slip deeper into Salvatore's orbit, that world with its hidden rules might one day reach Danny too. She wondered whether she was unknowingly pulling her innocent brother closer to a danger he knew nothing about. The thought alone that something could threaten him because of her choices was enough to make her feel sick with fear. Because if there was one thing this life of so many losses had taught Tessa, it was that she could lose anything: money, trust, peace, but she must never lose Danny. He was the last thing left, the reason she woke each morning and pushed through 2 endless shifts, the only person in the world still waiting for her with a scrap of paper beside the rice pot. And the thought that she might put him in danger just because her heart had begun to lean toward a man who belonged to such a world made her feel like someone selfish. That night, she sat like that for a very long time, not weighing advantages or losses, not measuring right from wrong, only listening to the most primitive instinct inside her screaming to step back, to protect the small home she had fought so hard to keep, to build her wall even higher before it was too late. That instinct was so strong that at one point she picked up her phone intending to send Salvatore something that would create distance, but then she put it down again because she didn't know what to write. She looked out the window where the street light cast faint streaks across the floor, and for the first time since meeting him, the warmth those Thursday nights had given her was covered by a new hesitation. Salvatore, from someone she had been curious to understand, someone she had begun to think she might be able to trust, suddenly became the embodiment of a world that made her wary. And when morning was nearly breaking, when the first cars of the new day rose from the street below, Tessa was still sitting there with the cold cup of tea in her hands, her heart tangled with a fear that had not yet taken any clear shape, knowing only that something inside her had changed, and that the Thursday nights to come would no longer be as simple as before. While Tessa was lying awake with her own fear, something else was quietly unfolding on the other side of the city, something she knew nothing about because Salvatore, from the moment he had begun paying attention to the server with hands that knew how to speak, had ordered Big Mike to quietly find out why someone like her had been pushed into his room on that very first night. He was a man who never believed in coincidence, and his instinct proved right. After only a short time, Big Mike pieced together the entire conspiracy and brought his master the unvarnished truth. He revealed that Tessa's first appearance in the private room was the result of an orchestrated trap designed by Brett and his crew to humiliate her for amusement. They had anticipated a cruel rejection, completely blind to the profound connection they were about to. The Big Mike also repeated the filthy rumors Brett had spread afterward to disgrace her. And when Salvatore finished hearing it all, his face showed no emotion at all, but a dangerous stillness settled over him, because he understood that the woman he valued, the only person in many years who had spoken to him, as if speaking to a human being, had been brought into his life through a joke aimed at the very weakness he hid most carefully, and that all this time she had been quietly enduring those poisonous rumors without saying one word of complaint to him. The following Thursday night, when Tessa stepped into the private room with her heart still tangled in the unease of that sleepless night, she immediately sensed that something was different about him. He did not smile the way he had in recent weeks. He looked at her for a long while, then lifted his hands, and what he signed made her go still. He told her he knew everything. He knew about the trap that night, knew about Brett, knew about the rumors the man had spread to humiliate her. He said he knew she had been enduring it alone this entire time. And then, with a calm more frightening than anger, he signed that she did not have to endure another day of it, that all she had to do was nod, and he would make Brett disappear from her life, make sure the man never dared open his mouth to speak another word about her again. He did not explain how, nor did he need to. The sharp, deliberate motion of his hands carried a quiet authority that required no translation, making her fully realize that his world operated on absolute consequences rather than idle threats. Tessa froze. She stood there inside the room that had once felt like the warmest place she had, and for the first time she felt an invisible distance between herself and the man before her, because he was offering her a kind of power she had never possessed, the power to erase the person who had tormented her with only a nod. And some part of her, the part worn down by rumors, by unfairness, by months of being cornered, trembled for one brief instant at that offer. Just one instant, at the feeling that at last there was someone powerful enough to stand on her side and end everything. But immediately after that instant came a fear of herself, because she realized she was standing before a crossroad she had never imagined, with the temptation to be freed from Brett once and forever on one side, and on the other the question of what kind of person she would become if she accepted that a human being, no matter how cruel, could be dealt with in a way she did not even dare picture. She looked at Salvatore, looked into the eyes waiting for her answer, and she realized this was not only a choice about Brett, it was a choice about herself, about how far she would allow her pain to lead her. She opened her mouth meaning to say something, but found she was not ready. So she only signed that she needed him to give her a little time, then left the room carrying a burden even heavier than the one she had brought in. 4 days after that evening, Tessa did not send Salvatore a single message, not because she wanted to punish him or avoid him, but because she truly did not know what to say when her mind was still a tangled mess of unanswered questions. She went to work, came home, cooked dinner, sat with Danny, and did all those ordinary things like a machine while her thoughts never stopped circling around his offer. And if the sleepless night after witnessing what happened at the restaurant had been a purely instinctive fear, these days were different. The fear had settled enough to make room for something heavier, a struggle of reason she could not escape. At first, she told herself that the safest thing was to step back, to quietly create distance from Salvatore and let everything cool down. She thought that if she pulled away, her life would return to what it had been. She would once again be the invisible server. The rumors would eventually fade when there was nothing left to talk about. And most important of all, Danny would be safe, far from the world of hidden rules she had only glimpsed. That reasoning sounded sensible and wise. It soothed the frightened part of her. But every time she almost convinced herself, something inside her caught and would not let her rest. It was not until the fourth day, one evening as she sat quietly by the window after Danny had gone to sleep, that she finally touched the thing that had been troubling her and was able to name it. She realized that if she quietly withdrew from Salvatore's life out of fear, without a single explanation, then she would be doing to him the very thing she hated most in Brett and the others. She would be deciding for him, cutting him out of a choice he had the right to take part in. Brett and those people had turned him into a pawn in their joke without bothering to ask him a single question, arranging everything about him behind his back, as if he had no right to speak for himself. And now if she silently disappeared just to ease her own fear, she too would be treating him like a problem to remove instead of a human being with the right to choose. That realization filled her with shame because over the past weeks she had taken pride in believing she was different from the people who had hurt him, that she was the one who had seen him as a person. And yet now she had merely done the very thing that would take from him the right to be recognized as one. She also realized a second thing, something deeper, that the real question she had to answer was not Brett, not whether she should let Salvatore act or not, but what kind of person she was going to become. Because if she nodded to that offer, if she let her pain and exhaustion lead her to accept that a human being could be handled in the ways of the underworld, then she would no longer be herself. She would become someone who used another person's power to solve her own hurt. And if she did that, how would she be any different from people who were used to using strength to press down on those weaker than themselves? Danny was still there in every one of her thoughts, but this time she thought of him not only through fear, but through another question. She wondered if one day Danny grew older and learned that his sister had once stood before a choice like this. What would she want him to see her choose? Did she want to teach her brother that human dignity had to be protected even when it belonged to someone who had harmed you? Or that once a person had enough power in their hands, they were allowed to crush anyone who had ever caused them pain? And when that question appeared clearly in her mind, Tessa knew she had her answer, not because it was easy or safe, but because it was the only answer that would still allow her to look straight into her brother's eyes and into her own every morning. She placed her hand on her phone, and for the first time in 4 days, she sent Salvatore a short message saying that she needed to see him, that there was something she had to tell him, not through written words, but directly with her own hands in the room where everything had begun. Salvatore replied to her message almost immediately. And so the following night, Tessa stepped into that private room again, but this time she did not carry a serving tray. She came as herself with something she had spent 4 days learning how to name. He was already sitting there waiting for her, and when she closed the door and sat down across from him, he looked at her with quiet attentiveness, as if he understood that what she was about to say would matter. Tessa drew in a deep breath and lifted her hands. She began by thanking him. She signed that she knew his offer had come from a desire to protect her, that in her whole life full of loss, no one had ever been willing to stand up for her that way, and precisely because of that, she had to be honest. Then, she looked straight into his eyes and refused. She signed that she did not want him to retaliate against Brett. It wasn't about forgiveness, but about maintaining the truth of who they were to each other. She looked into his eyes and explained that on the night she was pushed into his room, they had both been treated as objects for someone else's cruel amusement. If she accepted his offer to crush Brett now, she would be doing the exact same thing, turning his existence into a mere weapon for her vindication. She signed slowly, ensuring he caught every movement. "You are not a tool for my anger, Salvatore. You are a man, and I will not treat you as anything less." When she finished signing that sentence, she saw something shift faintly in Salvatore's eyes, but she did not stop, because she knew that if she had decided to be honest, then she had to be honest all the way through. She signed about the night she had not slept after seeing his 2 men come to speak with Brett. She did not hide her fear from him. She admitted that the sight had frightened her, that for the first time she had truly seen the world standing behind him, a world with hidden rules she did not understand at all, and did not know whether she belonged in. She told him about Danny, about her fear that if she stepped deeper into his orbit, one day that world might reach the younger brother she had spent her whole youth protecting. She signed that there had been a moment when she had meant to quietly step back, to disappear from his life without explanation, so everything could return to peace. But then she realized that doing so would also be a way of deciding for him, of taking away his right to speak just like the people who had hurt him, and that was something she did not want to do. So, instead of vanishing in silence, she had chosen to come here and tell him every truth in her heart, both her feelings and her fears, and then give back to him the right he should have always had. She signed that she could not decide what stood between them alone, that he had the right to know who she was, what she feared, what she wanted, and after knowing all of that, he would be the one to choose whether he wanted to step into the life of a poor server with a younger brother who needed protection and a heart used to building walls. And she too would choose whether she was brave enough to step into his orbit. But whatever the answer was, it had to come from the truth, not from avoidance. She lowered her hands after saying everything, and she felt a strange relief. The relief of someone who, for the first time in a very long while, had dared to place her whole true self, both the strong parts and the fragile ones, before another person without hiding anything. The private room sank into silence, a silence unlike any they had shared before, thick and trembling, because now every card had been turned face up on the table, and Tessa sat there, her heart pounding, waiting to see what the man across from her would do with all the truth she had just placed in his hands. Salvatore sat in silence for a very long time after Tessa lowered her hands, so long that she began to worry she had said too much, that perhaps she had just rejected the only thing he knew how to offer a person. But when he finally lifted his hands, what he signed made her the one who went still. He said that throughout his life, ever since the day he lost his father and was forced to grow up overnight in order to inherit the world he now lived in, no one had ever come to him without bringing one of two things, either fear or greed. People came to him because they feared him and wanted to please him, or because they knew he had money and power and wanted to trade for something. He had lived too long among people who saw him only as a force to use or a danger to avoid, so long that he had almost forgotten he was also a human being who could be treated another way. He signed that when he offered to handle Brett for her, part of him had thought that was what she wanted, because it was the only language his world knew how to speak. Someone hurt him, and he made them disappear. That was the rule. That was the way everything around him had worked for so long. But she had just done something no one had ever done. She had refused his power not because she didn't need it, but because she wanted to protect his dignity. She had seen in him a person worthy of respect, not a weapon to be used. He signed that in the moment she told him he wasn't her knife, she had given him something that neither power nor money in his world had ever been able to buy for him, the feeling of being seen as a whole human being. He paused for a while, then signed that he would not touch Brett, not because Brett deserved to be spared, but because she deserved to have someone beside her who did not turn every wound into blood and fear. He said that if being near her meant he had to learn a way of living different from the one he had known, then he was willing to do that. And at that moment, Tessa saw a completely unhidden warmth in the eyes everyone whispered were cold as ice. Justice for Brett, as it turned out, did not come from the underworld she had feared, but from the place she least expected. Because during those days, Owen, the young waiter who had witnessed the whole confrontation in the wine storage room and had carried the weight of guilt for weeks, finally found the courage he had lacked for so long. He realized that his silence all this time had also been a form of complicity, and that if he kept lowering his head, he would forever remain the cowardly version of himself he despised. So he quietly gathered everything he knew, the slanderous messages Brett had posted in the group chat, the times he had seen Brett harass others, and the things he knew about the other girls who had quietly quit before because they could no longer endure him. Then he brought all of it to the restaurant's senior manager through the proper process, without hiding his own part in the original joke. He accepted that he might also be implicated, as long as the truth came to light. And this time, faced with concrete evidence and the testimony of a witness who dared to step forward, the restaurant management could not ignore it the way they had once ignored scattered complaints in the past. An internal investigation was opened, and Brett's behavior, which he had hidden for so long beneath the disguise of joking, was finally brought into the light for exactly what it was. When Tessa heard from Owen during a shift that he was the one who had reported everything, she looked at him for a long time and gave a small nod. Not the nod of easy forgiveness, but of recognition that a young man had chosen to do the right thing late rather than never. And in that moment she understood that real justice, the kind of justice that allowed people to lift their heads, never came from fear or crushing power, but from the courage of those willing to name what was wrong and stand on the side of the truth. The internal investigation ended the way it should have ended long ago. Brett was dismissed by the restaurant through the proper process, not with any loud dramatic scene, but simply as the inevitable consequence of what he himself had done once the truth was finally brought into the light. He left far more quietly than he had ever boasted while he was there, with no one left for him to intimidate, no name left for him to borrow and use for bragging. And when he walked out of the restaurant door for the last time, Tessa felt no triumph and no pity. She felt only a calm relief, the relief of someone who had just had a burden lifted after carrying it for far too long. Carla, after Brett was gone, became completely quiet. She no longer threw sharp words behind Tessa's back, not because she had suddenly become kind, but because the support for her cruelty was no longer there. She chose to keep her distance, avoiding Tessa's eyes whenever they crossed paths, and Tessa needed nothing more than that. She had never wanted them to like her. She only needed the boundary she had drawn in the wine storage room that day to be respected, and now it was being respected. The person who changed the most was Owen. After stepping forward to report the truth, he did not become a hero in everyone's eyes. Some coworkers even looked at him with cold disapproval because he had dared to break the group's unspoken rule of silence. But Owen himself was different. He came to work standing a little straighter, no longer lowering his face and avoiding people the way he had before, and he began treating Tessa with sincere respect. Sometimes he even hesitantly asked her a few questions about sign language as if he were trying, in his clumsy way, to better understand the world he had once carelessly turned into a joke. Tessa did not rush to embrace him, but she was not cold to him, either. She understood that a young person who knew how to admit wrongdoing and try to change deserved a chance. As for Salvatore, the relationship between him and Tessa after that night did not suddenly turn into a radiant love story full of promises. It grew slowly and carefully, exactly the way two people who were used to building walls around themselves would find their way toward each other. They still met on Thursday evenings, still spoke with their hands in the private room, but now there were no more hidden things between them. There was one thing Salvatore did that Tessa would remember for a long time. He knew about Danny, knew about the younger brother who lived in a world with fewer sounds, and about the money Tessa had once saved for him before being deceived out of it years ago. And although with his power and money he could have erased every financial burdens on her shoulders with a single phone call, he did not do that. He was perceptive enough to understand that doing so would only turn her into someone indebted to him instead of someone standing beside him as an equal, and that those old hospital bills were a burden. Tessa wanted to finish paying in her own way, as she always had, with her own sweat and dignity. Instead, the only thing he did was open a door for her. He introduced Danny to a free sign language class for young people, at a center he knew, a place where Danny could study more, meet people in similar circumstances, and find a community of his own. Salvatore did not pay anyone. He did not use influence to force anything. He only gave her the information about that door, and then let her and Danny decide whether to step through it or not. And Tessa understood that this was real respect. Not the dazzling kind of rescue that turned another person into someone who owed gratitude, but the act of placing a choice in their hands and trusting that they were strong enough to walk forward on their own. What she also gradually realized during those weeks was that Salvatore was changing. He began speaking of different plans for the future, things beyond the underworld he had inherited. He spoke of slowly shifting his focus toward transparent businesses, of carefully untangling himself from old obligations one step at a time. He did not promise to become a completely different man overnight because they both understood life did not work that way. But the direction he was moving in was enough for Tessa to see that the man who had once lived alone in the middle of his own power was quietly searching for a path toward the light, and that perhaps, only perhaps, she and Danny would become part of the future he was beginning to dare dream about. A few months passed, and on a Thursday night, like so many Thursday nights before, Tessa once again stepped into the private room at the end of the hallway. But this time everything was so different from that first evening that sometimes she wondered whether the woman walking in today was still the same girl who had once been pushed into this room as a joke. She no longer carried a serving tray. She came as someone who was expected, and Salvatore was already sitting there, lifting his eyes to look at her with a gaze she had now come to know so well. The gaze the whole city had once whispered was cold as ice, but to her had become the warmest place of all. She sat down across from him, and in that quiet moment, her eyes accidentally drifted toward the narrow crack in the door leading to the service corridor, the little opening where, many months before, three faces had once pressed close to wait for her to fall apart. The crack that had once served as a stage for cruelty disguised as a joke. Now it was only an ordinary crack in a door. No one stood there anymore. No eyes lurked in secret. No mocking laughter echoed back. It had returned to its humble true nature, a quiet line bordering the private space of two people. And Tessa realized that the greatest change was not in the room itself, but in what had happened inside it. Salvatore saw her looking toward the crack in the door, and he understood what she was thinking. He lifted his hands and signed a short sentence. He said he had once thought this room was the safest place he had because it was private and no one could reach him there. But now he knew it had only truly become a place since she walked into it. That simple sentence made Tessa laugh, a light and complete smile. Smile of someone who had finally found a place where she did not have to build walls. They sat there, speaking with their hands in the absolute stillness of the room, not a single sound passing between them, and yet Tessa had never felt more deeply heard. Outside, the city was still loud with car horns and hurried footsteps. Outside, there was still an entire world from which Salvatore was carefully, step by step, trying to untangle himself so he could move toward a brighter life. But inside this small room between two people who had long been used to hiding behind walls, there was only silence. And it was the most beautiful silence she had ever known. Not the silence of loneliness or of things left unsaid, but the silence of two people who understood each other so deeply that sound was no longer necessary. The cruel joke once created to make her the center of ridicule had turned into something none of the people who set it up could ever have imagined. By accident, they had led two of the loneliest people to find each other. And the story of Tessa and Salvatore, which had begun with a scheme meant to degrade human dignity, ultimately became proof of the very opposite. That dignity, once protected, has the power to change even the things that seem impossible. And if there is one thing this story hopes to leave in each of our hearts, it is that a person's dignity must never be turned into someone else's joke. That true listening does not belong to the ears, but to attention and compassion. That sometimes the people who seem most different, a poor waitress and a powerful man, one betrayed by trust and one lonely inside his own strength, can heal each other simply by seeing one another as whole human beings, and that the greatest strength a person can possess does not lie in the power to crush others, but in the kindness to lift them up. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please press the like button, share this video with the people you believe need to hear it, too. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can listen together to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. Tessa and Salvatore's story was never just about danger, secrets, or the man everyone feared. It was about being seen by the one person who finally looked close enough to understand. Tessa spent years staying quiet, carrying pain no one bothered to notice. But kindness, loyalty, and love have a way of finding the people who need them most. If this story touched you, hit like and share it with someone who believes quiet people often carry the deepest hearts. Subscribe for more emotional stories about love, sacrifice, family, and the moments that change a life forever. Before you go, tell us in the comments which part of Tessa's story stayed with you the most. Thank you for listening until the end. We'll see you in the next story.